morning, and you are very welcome to today's CBI at 10 webinar. My name's Kerry Thomas. I'm one of the editors at a news startup called Tortoise. Great pleasure to be doing these conversations as ever in conjunction with the CBI. Always on these calls, what we really want is questions from you. It really helps the conversation along. It really helps, I think, people at the CBI to understand what's happening at grassroots out there in the country, so it's got a sort of usefulness beyond the immediate conversation. So questions, comments, do put them into the chat and we will try to put them to our panelists today. If you want to put something in anonymously, then just write anon, A-N-O-N, at the top of your question or comment, and we will deal with it in confidence, of course. And I think it was probably inevitable, wasn't it, that after Brexit we would begin to talk about trade more than we had in a generation, because we'd fundamentally changed our trading relationship with our biggest partners so that we could form a new set of trading relationships. So the question of who the UK trades with and how was just bound to loom larger. What we couldn't have foreseen, I think, back in 2016 at all, is that the pandemic would usher in a whole new set of questions about trade to do with resilience of countries and supply chain, which I think is what we're in the middle of now. So we're here this morning with trade at the front of our minds. How can the British government work with businesses and with organisations like the CBI to create conditions so that trade can flourish? And in particular, we're thinking about how companies are adapting to the post-Brexit changes and the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement. We want to talk about insights on the global trade deals that are in the works at the moment, and also just a little bit on how trade fits into the CBI's Seize the Moment strategy, which we'll come back to shortly. We have a great bunch of people with us. We have a senior person from the CBI, as ever, Lord Karen Billamoria, President of the CBI. Karen, good morning. I'll come to you in just a second. We've got Amanda Tickell, who's Partner and Head of Tax and Trade Policy at Deloitte. And we've got Tony Mishevsky, who is the Managing Director of Antec. I'll get Tony to explain exactly what Antec is when I come to him in a few minutes. But Karen, Lord Billamoria, if I can start with you, we'd like to start with a sort of general look around. What have been the big things on the CBI's agenda in the last week or so?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and great to be with all of you. We're in a very, very unique situation. Go back to May, when I had the privilege of chairing the B7 before the G7, and we had Dr. Geeta Gopinath, the chief economist of the IMF, who said at that time that the UK would have a V-shaped recovery. It would be a recovery that, because of our £400 billion of investment into saving the economy and businesses and jobs, and because of the vaccination program that were leading the way, we would have a bounce back that would be resilient and quick. What has happened since, of course, is we have had the fuel shortage. We've had the lorry driver shortage. We've had labor shortages across the board in almost every sector. The energy crisis, inflation in many, many areas. So we really are in a situation now where this recovery, although there is growth, is fragile. We had the good news this morning. The inflation figures have gone up to 3.2%, have actually gone down a little bit, they're 3.1%. And initially the expectation was 4.5% would be the peak. Now people are talking about a much higher figure than that. And is it not going to be temporary? Is it going to be permanent? And when are these labor shortages going to come down? So there's a lot of uncertainty. The good news is that the vaccines are working. Our vaccination program is now going down to 12-year-olds and above. Of course, there's a challenge with booster jabs and getting those booster vaccines implemented at speed. And of course, winter coming up and the worry about flu, as well as the vaccine as well. So still uncertainties, but a much, much better position than we were. If you look back to this time last year, there was no vaccination at that time. So we are in a much stronger position. And as long as the sad deaths and the hospitalizations are minimized and can keep the economy open, we then have to deal with all these other challenges. And on top of that, we've had tax rises. Going back to the budget, the increase in corporation tax to 25% in 2 years' time, that was balanced by a super deduction so that you could get investment relief of 130%, which is fantastic to encourage investment. But corporation tax going up to 25% from 19% in one go in 2023. Then we've had the thresholds for income tax being frozen. That is in effect a tax rise. Then we've had the national insurance rise. Now that's not 1.25, by the way. It's 1.25 times 2 because it's for employers and employees. It's actually 2.5%. Then you've got a dividend tax on top of that. So you add all this up and we've got the highest tax burden in 70 years. And high taxes anyway are not good for an economy. And high taxes at a time when you're coming out of a pandemic, when the economy is fragile, when businesses have suffered a lot, could stifle the growth and the rebound. So we are worried about the high taxes as well. And then the government says they want a high wage economy. And they say they want a high skilled, high investment, high productivity economy. But if you don't have the other three, you can't have a high wage economy. You can only have a high wage economy if you've got the high skills, if you've got the high investment, and if you've got the high productivity. So the challenge now is can we, with the help of the government, continue to work closely with the government, which is what we've done throughout the pandemic. I can give you example after example of how closely we've worked with the government, from the job retention scheme to the bounce back loans, to the VAT being reduced from 20% to 5%, to the social distancing being reduced from 2 meters to 1 meter, to mass testing being introduced. That was a huge thing that I personally called for in August last year, and came in from November onwards. The government started to listen and act on it. We now have those tests freely available. Will they continue to be freely available to businesses and to individuals as we go into the winter? Then we've had the pandemic that we've had to deal with as well. So number of challenges, but the good news is we have a fantastic relationship with government. We work with them very, very closely, and together we've been able to face the biggest nightmare the global community has seen since the Second World War for 1.5 years. Now we've got to come out of it collaboratively together.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. An extraordinary range of things have happened, and it's hard to know whether to take comfort from that or start to get a bit weary, because they do seem to keep happening, don't they? But let's turn to trade, Karen, because what would you say are the big priorities from the CBI's perspective now in the post-Brexit trade agenda?
Yes, so we have always been a great trading nation. This term Global Britain, as President of CBI, one of my 4 priorities from the beginning has been Global Britain. And I'm sorry, I've been using the term well before the Prime Minister and the government have been using it. And I passionately believe in Global Britain. We are the second largest recipient of inward investment in the world. We are the second largest exporter of services in the world. We are a trading nation. We've now got to adjust to this new environment, an environment where for 40 years, we're part of the European Union, which, whichever way you look at it, whether it's declining or not, makes up almost half our trade as we speak. Individual countries within the European Union, people often don't realize this. Germany is one of our handful of largest trading partners. Holland is our 4th largest trading partner. Italy is one of our top 10 trading partners. So individual European countries, let alone France, are our biggest trading partners, let alone the European Union on the whole. Of course, America is the #1 trading partner. So looking ahead, how do we have Global Britain being a magnet for inward investment? So we've had the Global Investment Summit that has just taken place yesterday. We've had leaders from around the world come to the UK. How can we make it a magnet? Financial services is very important here. The City of London has got to continue to be always one of the top 2 financial centres in the world. Our tax system needs to be attractive. And this is why high taxes not only stifle a recovery, but high taxes also affect inward investment, because you've got to have an attractive environment to attract that inward investment. And of course, encouraging exports. Now, many of our companies don't export at all. Our SME exporters, the superstar exporters, as you call them, who export more than 10 SKUs to more than 10 countries, make up barely 14%. In Germany, it's 40%. So we've got to encourage our companies to export. And the government schemes like the government guaranteed loans for exports is fantastic to encourage, give finance for those exports as well. So we've got a lot to do. And of course, movement of people. We no longer have free movement of the European Union, but we've got a points-based immigration system. And what we're saying at the CBI is, yes, that points-based immigration system should give this country the skills that it needs across every sector, but also the understanding is if at any time there is a shortage, then we should activate the shortage list. And the Migration Advisory Committee, one of the suggestions we made, should be like the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, that independently makes a recommendation to government saying that at this particular time, you need to let in 20,000 lorry drivers, or you need to let in 2,000 butchers, or whatever sector requires at a particular time a temporary visas to be granted, whether it's for a year, whatever the period that they recommend, those temporary visas, and it's opened up so we have access to the people we need from around the world. And that is what government is listening, but I think needs to listen more.
Yeah, I can see actually a comment that I'll come back to you with later, Karen, from Tony Goodyear, which is on that particular issue, but I'll bring that in a little while. Before I come to that, Karen, there's a lot of talk about the opportunities that are going to arise from new trade deals. What is the CBI's role in dealing with government and in sort of representing businesses to support those new trade deals that are being discussed?
Yes, this is where, again, I think I'm so proud of the work that CBI does. Well, we've got a team of 250 fabulous, enthusiastic, committed, professional, amazing individuals, young, dynamic. And when it comes to trade, we have, and I can say this because I've been involved in this firsthand, when we rolled over those 66 trade agreements that the European Union had with other countries like Canada, they all had to be rolled in before the 31st of December, rolled over. First, the challenge was, were they going to roll them over? Because you could say, logically, a country giving a deal for 500 million trading bloc, the biggest people, the biggest in the world, would they give the same terms to a country of 67 million people? And logic would say they wouldn't. Well, they did. We managed to roll them all over, and we had to get them done by a deadline. And you know, we at the CBI actively work directly with the high commissioners, ambassadors of those countries to help get those over the line. And Canada is a very good example. We just about managed to do it. The next thing is the new trade agreements that we can have with countries we have not had trade agreements with. America, of course, was the big one. We've been told now that's not realistically likely. It's our #1 trading partner by far. It will continue to be so, but there isn't going to be a trading agreement with them in the short term. However, Australia, the CBI played a major role in getting the Australia Free Trade Agreement. You know, that free trade agreement was negotiated in 365 days. It is the most comprehensive modern trade agreement in the world. It's got goods, it's got services, it's got innovation, it's got IP, it's got movement of people, it's got everything in one trade agreement. And the movement of people, 18 to 35-year-olds from both our countries can go and work and live in each other's countries for 3 years, unrestricted. And that's fantastic, that mobility of young people in particular, let alone for studies. So it really helped the CBI just before the Trade Minister, Dan Tehan, went into his final negotiation, the most important meeting with Liz Truss, who was the DIT Secretary of State at the time. He had a 1-hour meeting, literally before he walked into the room, which the CBI organized with the key stakeholders, including the National Farmers Union, who are a member of the CBI. Agriculture was a sensitive issue, and he heard firsthand from all of us. And the Australian High Commissioner, time after time, George Brandis, has singled out the CBI as helping Australia to get that deal over the line. And we had a big event last week in London, which I was on the platform with the Trade Minister, with the High Commissioner, celebrating this deal. New Zealand is next. New Zealand is much smaller. Australia is about 22 billion pounds. New Zealand's just over £1 billion. Will be a similar deal. That will be closed soon. India's got huge potential, but do you know we only do 24 billion pounds worth of bilateral goods and services with India? We've signed an enhanced trade partnership with India to double that by 2030. And here's the good news. The gun has been fired, the starting gun, for the negotiations for a free trade agreement. We've appointed our negotiator within the DIT. The official has been appointed, and that is going full speed ahead. Liz Truss, his foreign secretary, is going to be out there soon, and how long that will take, I don't know. And here's the last point I want to make on this. The potential for trade and trade deals, the whole of the Commonwealth, over 50 countries, including India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, make up less than 10% of Britain's trade. Just imagine how much more we can do. And finally, the CPTPP. We now have a strategic review, our independent review that was released earlier this year, our defense and foreign policy and security review, where we are openly saying there's a tilt, not to the Asia-Pacific, a tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And the CPTPP trading group of 11 countries, by the Australia deal, will help us to join the CPTPP. The New Zealand deal will help us, and they will be ambassadors for us to join. And that is 110 billion pounds worth of trade. And then, of course, on top of all that, there's China. Whatever way you look at it, China is 100 billion pounds worth of trade with the United Kingdom as we speak.
Fantastic. Karen, we're going to come back to a lot of those questions. I think we'll certainly talk about India. I think we'll talk about CPTPP a little later. But thank you for now. Certainly come back to you too. Amanda, let me bring you in. So as I mentioned at the top, head of tax partner at Deloitte. If you look back over the last 10 months, we're 10 months into the UK-EU trade and cooperation agreement. Can you give us a sort of scorecard for business? What aspects of it business is adapted well to? What's still a bit sticky? How does that look to you?
Okay, so just bringing it into that specifically, the TCA, the agreement between the UK and the EU, I think the first thing I'd say is it's not really just about the past 10 months that the TCA has been in operation. It is all that preparation that business did, excuse me, before the end of the transition period, because we knew for goods businesses we were coming out of the customs union. So I think there was a lot of effort put into understanding supply chains and the new processes. So I think our observation is that as a whole, business has actually adapted in the goods sector pretty well to the TCA. We did see a drop off of exports in the beginning half of the year, but actually now we're seeing UK export levels into the EU about back to where they were pre-pandemic, which is really encouraging, I think, the UK exports. Imports do remain a bit subdued, actually, and from the EU, that is, and it's unclear whether that's due to the pandemic or the terms of the TCA. Possibly EU businesses decided the UK market has been a bit complicated to supply into, even though the UK government has still deferred those filings of all the customs forms that are required. There were additional VAT requirements and others, or it could be because there is some restructuring that's gone on. So potentially, if you had one warehouse serving the whole of the EU, you might actually now have one in the UK and one in the EU to serve the whole market. So there has been some restructuring gone on, but generally well. The areas that I think we'll see in the next few months, hopefully as we start travelling and economy is opening up again to the services sector, are issues around moving people. I mean, that's the one really untested area, immigration rules. So particularly where a UK business needs to send somebody into another country to perform the actual service, so the Mode 4 type services. And those we think may, as countries start sort of applying the terms of the TCA more rigidly and more widely, become more complicated for UK business. I must say, on the plus side, it was interesting, Lord Bilimoria raising the new sort of skilled worker permits, because that is one area we're starting to hear business speak really positively about. And actually, although we are, there are widespread labour shortages, quite rightly just highlighted this morning. In this area, I think these permits seem to be going down very well. They give much more flexibility to workers and therefore employers, and this all helps with the overall attractiveness of the UK market. So in short, goods relatively well, obviously depends on your particular sector. Agri-food's difficult. The Northern Ireland trade remains very, very difficult for businesses, particularly if you're in Northern Ireland, and services, I think, yet to come.
Okay, there was a lot of concern before the TCA was signed about the effect of the end of passporting on financial services. I think it's important that we talk about services as well as goods in this conversation because of the skew of the British economy. The passporting, which allows, sort of shorthand, I think, is it allows a firm registered anywhere in the EU to do business in another EU state without, or EEA state without further authorization. Is the kind of, my kind of shorthand for it. What effect has the end of passporting had on financial services, Amanda?
Well, I do think this is one of the areas we haven't really seen the full impact on services trade yet. So what happened prior to the TCA, and as soon as we understood that there wasn't going to be the ability to just passport into EU, and that was pretty early on, that was made clear, that the financial services sector restructured to ensure that where they needed to, for regulatory reasons, they had a structure established in the EU from which to provide business into the EU market. So I think that restructuring happened, but what's happened with the pandemic overlay is that people have really been delivering their services remotely. So I think if they're potentially over time, there may be some pressure to build up the substance in those other markets in the EU for those various territories that the financial services chose to establish in. So we probably haven't seen the full impact yet, but you know, the financial services sector, from all the indicators that we've seen, remains very strong in the UK, actually. So it hasn't seen the end of the sector by any means. I think just shows how adaptable business is. I still think there's a bit more to be seen in terms of restructuring there, though.
Yeah, we heard from Lord Billamori a very sort of positive, upbeat view of the opportunities for British business within that new trade agenda. What would you say the opportunities are that we're looking at?
So specifically around trade, you know, Lord Billamori put it really very energetically. I don't think there's anything I could add to the overall picture, but what I would say is that from a business perspective, and when we're talking to businesses, it takes time. These trade agreements are on the table. It's very true that, you know, the government's really done fantastically in getting such an array of negotiations going, but they do take time, and they take time to land with business and to adapt into. And what we find is that until the terms are signed, sealed and delivered, it's actually quite hard to get business to take action generally, because they don't want to jump into a new structure or a new trade arrangement too early in case the deal isn't done. Now, even with Australia, although we have agreement in principle, that final trade agreement, you know, signing on the dotted line hasn't quite happened yet. So again, when that happens, I do think there's going to be a lot of interest in exactly what the terms say, and absolutely the sort of talent corridors that are set up for mobility of people, that's really exciting for businesses, and wherever tariffs are reduced is a good thing. I mean, in terms of opportunity, I do think the CPTPP is one of the best opportunities for the UK to go after, because it is actually an existing trading agreement. It's not like we'd have to negotiate, you know, chapter by chapter, term by term. And you know, 13% of GDP, it's an absolutely massive market.
Because we're not all experts, just remind us who's in the CPTPP and what it does.
We have 11 countries, and it's largely Asia. And what it does is it reduces, I think it's around 95% of tariffs. So it is very tariff free trade. And the really good thing about it is it has accumulation of origin. I'm sure you've heard before, one of the challenges, particularly in the TCA for business, has been determining rules of origin. So you have to show that if a product is to be determined as UK, it's been made and all its the majority of its components are UK sourced. Now, if you're in this big trading zone, which at 13% of GDP, 11 countries, soon to be 12 if we are accepted in, then you can have origin for your products that are coming from any of those markets. And in particular, if you took, say, cars, generally tariffs on cars are at least 10%. So if we were to move wholesale into the electric car market, it would enable things like batteries or things that we can't necessarily produce here in the UK to be sourced from other countries, but it would still have CPTPP origin, so you can trade back in that market without any origin restrictions or tariff restrictions. So that's why I think this trade zone is one that's particularly attractive to the UK.
I want to come to Tony in just a second, but before I do, Amanda, while we're getting excited about the potential of the CPTPP, what do you think is a realistic time frame on that, or an optimistic one, since we're being optimistic?
Yeah, well, we have, I mean, it's true, as I said, trade agreements do take time to be agreed, and we've only had our first accession meeting so far. So we expect negotiations to continue throughout 2022. So I think realistically, we're probably looking at 2023, all things going well on that front. I think the first one to cross the line will be that's been started from scratch, that is, as you say, not continuity, will be the Australia trade deal.
Yeah. Okay, Amanda, thank you so much. It's great to have you here, and we'll come back to you in a minute. But Tony, thank you for your patience. I want I want to bring you in. Perhaps you just start by telling us a little bit about Antec and what your where you trade and how you trade.
Right, so we're a high-tech engineering company based in Exeter. We're 50 people. In our 30 years of business, we've always exported. The nature of the business we're in, the oil business, is such that all our customers are usually outside Devon. So it's been a necessity. I spent 10 years personally working overseas, so I was aware of what was possible, and realised that trading overseas is the same as trading in the UK. You still need to have relationships, you still need to have products, etc. All those things go through. I think in the 30 years we've been in business, we've never shipped less than about 70% of our goods overseas. And for the first 20 years it was goods, stuff we take and put in a box. We're not big enough to warehouse or anything like that, so we usually manufacture high spec kit to order. And then in the last 10 years we've been selling services overseas. Now that service involves people and it involves equipment, so that is a step up in complexity in international trade, and it's been quite a challenge for us, and we've had to gear ourselves up with the skills required to trade like that.
Yeah, we've talked about trade in a couple of respects. We've talked about the sort of high level trade deals and that sort of macro side of things. We've also, Lord Bilimoria mentioned export guarantees and the sort of more practical day-to-day end of things. Is your experience of government mostly to do with things like export guarantees?
Yeah, so our interaction with government assistance has really been through whatever the various formations of the Department of Trade and Industry, or whatever it's called these days. And the fact that we don't necessarily know what it's called, suggests that we're not dealing with them every day. But I'll give you an example that they are helping on a practical level, which is the bit that we care about. So I have a team in Russia at the moment that the travel expenses are 60% paid. That makes a lot of difference because it's a speculative market for us. We've got to work things out. We also can help with accessed advice, so you can go to trade representatives for the in the consulates in countries, and they can tell you this is the way things work, etc. It's very high. It's very high level, but it gives you the confidence to go into a country. The one thing that I would pick up on is the export guarantee scheme. We find that doesn't hit our level at all. It's something that can be talked about as being wonderful. In practical sense, in 30 years we haven't been able to use it, and the reason I believe that's the case is that although we're trading, we need the finance, etc. The export finance guarantee scheme has to go through generally the banks, and the banks have to set up their own rules, and we've found that actually accessing that has been difficult. We've got a big tender which we're tendering for in Norway, and we've tried to access export finance guarantee, and so far we've just bounced off. It's just no, we're not, wouldn't be able to help you on that. So in a practical sense, export finance hasn't helped us a whole lot. We have more of an attitude, you're on your own, get on with it.
And the export guarantees, is that finance not available to you because the deals you're doing aren't big enough to meet the level that the banks think they need to be at, or is it some other blockage?
I'm not sure. It's generally, as a small business, we found it quite difficult to get finance. Just simply the high street banks aren't looking to support businesses of our size. We've gone to what are now called the alternative finance houses, but they aren't necessarily hooked into things like the export finance guarantee scheme. So some of them might be doing C-bills and the recovery loan scheme, etc., which are government-linked things, but they would have to get themselves set up to offer the export loan guarantee scheme. So I think some of the newer, more innovative finance houses don't necessarily have access to that scheme, and that's partly why.
Yeah, and given the experience you talk about, Tony, of a relative sort of independence from government initiatives, a sort of sense of pulling yourselves up by your own bootstraps, when you hear the conversation about future trade deals, about things that might happen with India or the CPTPP or Australia, do your ears prick up, or does that not seem directly relevant to a company like yours?
It's a timing thing. So if these things happen, it is so the right agreement can have a massive effect on us. At the moment, we're shipping goods in and out of Saudi Arabia. For example, Saudi Arabia is not part of the Carnet scheme. There's no trade deal, etc. It is incredibly difficult. It takes months for us to get equipment in and out of Saudi Arabia. If there was a trade deal that reduced duties, etc., on our last shipment, that would have saved us £250,000, which we managed to get in on temporary, but it's taken us a year to get the money back, etc. So in a practical sense, a good trade deal makes a lot of difference to us. Do I get excited about talking about something that's going to happen in 5 years' time? No, because it's probably not going to affect us until 10 years' time. So it's just a question of having to be more short-term in our outlook.
Great. Okay, Tony, thanks for that. Karen Billamori, can I just put to you a question that's come in from Suki Ubi, who's just asked, are you hearing from UK businesses that they're finding EU supply chains reorientating away from the UK, thinking not just of trade today, but also strategic investment or business decisions that might hurt our trade later on? Are you seeing that kind of reorientation?
I've been having meetings on a regular basis, one-on-one, with the EU ambassador, with the EU Trade Commissioner, Mara McGuinness, with ambassadors from Italy, Holland, the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Belgium. And of course, a lot of the conversation is about the Northern Ireland Protocol and resolving that. And in fact, a lot of those discussions that we had have now come through on the concessions that the Europeans have made now in trying to ease the flow of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And of course, the big issue that's still to be resolved there is the European Court of Justice. I've been with Lord Frost, talking to him about it just the other day. This is something we need to resolve, the Northern Ireland situation. It's got to be done. All these talk of Article 16 really should not be there at all. We need to resolve it, and I think in the next few weeks we might. But the European countries themselves are very, very keen to continue the trade with us. And if you think about at the moment, we don't do checks on European goods coming in here. The Europeans are already implementing their checks on our goods going over there. We will in due course, but there is so much trust that already exists. But to Amanda's point, there are people already making moves of setting up warehouses from our side in Europe. But from their point of view, they still see us as a very, very important market, and bilaterally, they want to do everything they can to increase bilateral trade going forward. So I may make one fundamental point. With the CTA, the agreement that we have with the European Union is actually a very basic agreement. And all these deals that we've rolled over with the European Union, the big opportunity is to make them bespoke between the UK and those individual countries. That's a huge task in the years ahead. And the biggest one of them all is 50% of our trade with the European Union, where we can build in financial services, we can build in mutual recognition of qualifications, we can build in mobility of people, we can build in so many things if we have that goodwill. And at the moment, if we're fighting, battling, arguing over things like the protocol, we need to resolve those issues so we can move on and start building on what is a huge opportunity.
Yeah, and let me just pick up on something that Tony was saying, because I was surprised to hear that a company like his, which exports so broadly and so widely, has had no real interaction with the government over the loan guarantee scheme and those kind of measures. Is there room for reform of that scheme as one of the elements of a new trade strategy?
The key to that is it's an age-old situation. When I built up Cobra Beer, one of the ways I financed it in the early days, because I had no security, I had no money, I had no collateral, was to get the small firms loan guarantee scheme, which at one stage the government would guarantee 75% or up to 85% of the loan, and the bank would have to take the risk of 25%, 15%. Do you know how difficult it is to get those loans? Because the banks don't want to take even a 15% risk. So over here, you've got a bank, the government guarantees export finance 80%, but 20%, you're taking a risk. So if the business is willing to put a deposit down of 20%, you'll get the loan. And the same goes for the bounce back loans. This is what I fought for in March last year. I remember I was asked my advice and I said, if the government doesn't guarantee the loans 100%, the money will not flow through. The CBILS money started to flow, but it didn't flow through. Eventually, the government listened to me, listened to the CBI, and the bounce back loans, over 1 million businesses have received those loans. And I meet so many people who say, thank you for doing that. That saved our business. That gave us that vital cash flow we needed. Wouldn't have happened if the government hadn't guaranteed 100%.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen. Amanda, let me again just pick up on something that Lord Billamori has said. If the TCA, the agreement with the EU, is a sort of, as Lord Billamori said, a baseline to begin to start from, do you see much appetite for improving it, for refining it, for bringing services into it? Is that something that you think it'd be great to get there, but does it seem realistic in in the near term?
I think, yeah, it's timing, isn't it? I mean, I think we're going to build from this. It's absolutely right. This is the basic terms of an agreement, without much time, frankly, to implement it. And it will be built on with bilateral negotiations. And, as an example, for instance, EU countries have better immigration terms for students to do ski seasons, for instance, with countries like Canada than they do the UK at the moment. But those were negotiated over a long period, and that will be overlaid onto the TCA terms. So I think there will, I don't totally agree, and things like recognition professional qualifications will happen between those sort of authorising bodies. But I would like to pick up on that earlier question you had on sort of, are we seeing business and investment leave the UK? I think from a Deloitte viewpoint, I think it's quite balanced. If we look across the spectrum of what we are helping business do, and it is about getting that effectiveness and efficiency with everything else that's going on. And so that we have supported to restructure maybe business into the UK as those that have had to establish some operation in the EU. And the other thing is there's a really active M&A market in the UK at the moment, and it just shows the level of confidence that foreign-owned businesses have in investing in UK businesses. So I think we can't forget that level of activity. And lastly, one point on Tony's point on your confidence around export. I think the government's new export support service is really something business should try. There is a phone number and an email, and you can get one-to-one advice on how to export, and whether that is it's largely meant to be getting that EU trade going, but and I don't believe there's a size restriction. It's not just for small businesses. So I would say just give it a go, do a search on gov.uk, phone up the number, and get exporting.
Okay, if you say it quickly, it sounds simple. Thank you. Tony, let me come back to you. When Karen Billamori started off talking about global Britain, just to sort of bring you into that conversation, which fresh markets have you got your eyes on now? Where are you looking for growth and opportunities?
So as I mentioned before, at the moment we're looking for work potentially in Russia. There are a lot of there's a lot of need for our services. We have unique products, unique services. The business environment there is very difficult for us to understand. So finding the people to support us in a small size to be able to do that is quite important. And as I say, that's where we have used the service of the trade services to help us with that, and they've been very supportive. And really, it's a question of looking around to see where the opportunity is. We're really more affected by what's happening in the energy market. So things like Alaska, United States, the North Sea. There's a tremendous change happening in the energy industry, and that brings a lot of opportunities for us.
Okay, Lord Billamori, I've got Andy Poole, the question on the same issue that Tony has raised about Antec. The banks are not interested in a project. We're talking about guarantees now. Banks are not interested in a project worth less than £5 million, he says. I suppose the question I'd love to know the answer to is whether the sticking point in that relationship is the government and the setup of those schemes, or whether it is the banks that we should be looking at as a blockage?
We have a free market, but we also have the British Business Bank, and one's got to give credit where it's due. Before the pandemic, the British Business Bank had a loan book of £8 billion. A year and a half later, its loan book was over 80 billion pounds. And it had to do that in the middle of a pandemic with people working remotely, putting out a whole load of new schemes, whether it's the C-bills, whether it's a bounce back, future scheme, lots of different schemes. So the government is doing its best. But banks, will take a certain risk, and they will not take more than a certain risk. And that is always going to be a challenge. But the best thing is there's more and more choice in the market now. And I found, even going back to my early days, you've got to maybe knock on 25 doors before one bank says yes, and you only need one of them to say yes. And they need to believe in you and believe in your business plan and believe in your idea, and you will get one person. And it is a bit of persistence that's required. It's not easy. I've been through it myself many times. But the government does, to their credit, try its best. You can't keep giving 100% guaranteed loans forever. This was in a time of crisis that was done. And it took a lot to get them to do that.
Okay, amazingly, it always happens. We were coming towards the end of our time. But Amanda, I just want to come back to you in the sort of minute we've got left. Because if I look back over the sort of, the course of the time I've worked in journalism, I suppose, so 30 plus years now, my kind of impression is that for many of those years, free trade, increasing trade was by far the biggest priority for governments and countries, and that perhaps things are a bit more complicated now. Maybe there are other factors at play: environment, sustainability, these new questions about resilience, questions about how we deal with people who are left behind in globalization, that whole raft of does it feel like a more complicated environment to you now than it would have been, a generation ago?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, whilst there are opportunities with new trade agreements, it does add complexity, and we haven't had, the expertise around really understanding those global trade agreements because they were done on our behalf in Europe for many decades. So I do think we've got to really deepen our understanding of how trade really works. But I totally agree with you. I think now there are questions on sustainability, on achieving net zero, on the impact on the climate, of what happens throughout your supply chain, and all of that is going to start getting reflected in trade agreements. As well, overlaid, this idea that you want to secure your own market, and there's a little bit of protectionism in some instances that's crept in. So I think the trend has definitely rode back from more globalization to a bit less. So I agree with you. Okay,
all right, Amanda, that's an interesting note to go out on, one I'm sure we'll come back to. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Lord Billamore, for joining us this morning. I'm just waiting to see if I've got a message to remind me what our next webinar is, but I can't see it. So I'll have to leave you in suspense about that. But thank you so much for your company this morning, and we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Bye for now.